So Australia is saved, maybe, for a few months, not for long. But it's not as bad as it was this time last month. Maybe. We'll see. I'm very unsure on this whole...
it isn't saved, is it? That's
no. Australia is still screwed. I wanted to open with good news, but there is no good news, sadly, because Australia is still a mental place. But it might work. It might help.
I interrupt this segment to bring you an important message about this stuff, the dollar. Not going so well, is it? Inflation is out of control and debt is even more out of control. In fact, the US government is on the verge of spending $1 trillion a year just servicing its debt. It spends about $6.6 trillion and it only collects about $4.6 trillion in revenues. So you can see that this situation is, rapidly taking a turn for the worse. You might want to consider some gold and silver, and that is why that we've done a partnership deal with Goldco and we've created lotuseatersgold.com. Go and check that out. It's an offer for our American viewers. You can transfer a proportion of your IRA into this, and if you do so, you're going to get some of this lovely stuff, some bonus silver thrown in on top, up to $10,000, or you can even take delivery of the physical gold to your home address if you prefer. So if you want money that goes clang when you put it down, check out lotuseatersgold.com.
Australia might be out of the weeds.
It's saved to... no.
It might not collapse as quickly.
Okay.
There we go.
Sell me this wonderful good.
Good news. So Australia, as I covered just a few months ago, was about to do an incredibly stupid thing, which was... introduced the Cultural Heritage Act, or whatever it was called, that was going to give Aboriginal groups in Australia the right, in West Australia, I should say, to be able to oversee any potential work or changes to land that farmers may be doing on their own private property, to see that if it... in fact, I'm doing a terrible job of recapping this. So I got this article specifically because it had a good recap of what the act did. So I'll just read through it here. The laws were designed to restrict any activities which could destruct or compromise the integrity of cultural heritage sites. However, the legislation inadvertently severely restricted the rights of Western Australian property owners with any parcels of land larger than 1,100 square metres requiring approval from official cultural surveyors before any work was conducted. This raised fears that farmers, miners, and regular landholders would be forced to pay as high as $1,200 a day to get approval to do work on the land, which could include digging a hole deeper than 50 centimetres or building a fence. Failure to comply with the legislation could have resulted in hefty penalties and fines or even prison time. So, as I went through in that last segment about this, what this was obviously doing was creating incentives for these Aboriginal cultural committees to just say any work that you were doing on your own land that may be necessary for your farm work was intruding on cultural heritage sites, and then they would have to go and do a survey for it, which you would have to pay for out of your own pocket. They pocket that money from it, and then they turn around and say, sorry, you can't build here because this is ours, for reasons. And within the legislation itself, within the guidance that was given to farmers in West Australia, it said, what questions can you ask? How do you know if this is actually a site of cultural relevance? That's an insensitive question. You're not allowed to ask that. When did this place become a site of cultural relevance? That's an insensitive question. You're not allowed to ask that. And the ideas of cultural relevance could also take in intangible factors, which means I made it up. There is a water spirit here that you're not allowed to disturb, therefore you can't do your necessary farm work that feeds the entire country. Very stupid piece of legislation, setting the entire country up for complete self-destruction, because, shockingly, agriculture kind of necessary. We mentioned Ukraine and the Holodomor just a moment ago. Them not being able to grow their own crops kind of hurt them, just a little bit. Can cause some problems, wouldn't you agree?
This is news.
I know.
Food good.
Along with that, something else that's been going on in Australia, which isn't being resolved as of yet, is that later on this year, I think by the end of the year, they're doing a Voice for Parliament referendum in the entirety of Australia, not just Western Australia, which, if people vote yes for it, will give, within the Australian Constitution, a recognition of Indigenous First Peoples. What it will also do is create a banter, which means I made it up. I long with that, something else that's been going on in Australia, which isn't being resolved as of yet, is that later on this year, I think by the end of the year, they're doing a Voice for Parliament referendum in the entirety of Australia, not just Western Australia, which, if people vote yes for it, will give, within the Australian Constitution, a recognition of Indigenous First Peoples. advisory board made up of Aboriginal peoples and tribal leaders and chieftains, etc., who will be able to advise Parliament on anything that Parliament is going to do legally if they're going to pass legislation and such. Now, this is just an advisory board, but we know within the current climate that if they just say that they want something done, Parliament will just do it. We're going to pass this law which will make it easier for farmers to do their farm work. Sorry, the Aboriginal Advisory Board says no, so you won't be able to do it. So the whole thing is just a complete grift, a complete shakedown, obviously something that will be destructive to Australia as a whole if they want to operate as a functional country. But that's where the good news comes in. And I'll go over that good news in a moment, because first, there's more content. There's more videos on the website. There's always more things going on that you should watch, because the things that we put out are really good, especially things like Contemplations, Josh's video series, where he was talking with Stelios about understanding the continent of Europe. And I will say some of this devolved slightly into Josh making fun of each nation as he was going by them and describing them. But this is the Anglo mindset. So if you want a good idea of the Anglo mindset, well then, come and watch this, and you can see what we think of you all, our European viewers, because we love you.
Is this just it's an invitation to be insulted? But then again, I mean, this is what we do with each other.
This is Europe.
You ever seen the Germans talk about the English?
Yeah, exactly.
Go both ways.
This is European banter. Yeah. This is what we do. We're all just good lads over here. We care deeply about one another, which is why I'm happy to insult you and your mother to your face.
There is a saying in the Balkans. I don't know how well I'm allowed to say this, but
tread lightly, but go on.
So you know you're in the Balkans when they stop saying you should go and F your mother and start saying you should go and F your father.
Okay.
For some reason, the culture just switches for some of them, and they just start saying, you should go F your father. It's like, what? Why would I do that? That's really weird.
It's a very strange thing to say.
Like, the mother stuff was at least a norm, but in insult world, but okay.
I mean, either way is insulting, I suppose. But let's go and see what's happened now, which is that they're not going to go ahead with it. It was implemented on the 1st of July, and just about a month later, they've turned around and said, well, that was a terrible idea. This was a really bad idea, guys. We might not do it. That was a few days ago. They said, we might not do it. So they've got in the government different factions who are campaigning for the yes vote for the Voice in Parliament referendum and the no vote. And the campaign director for the yes vote is a man called Dean Parkin, who said that he believed that the scrapping the laws will make it simpler to sell the voice. And that's a quite telling admission, wouldn't you say? Because we want to sell the idea that the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, who, if you want to run down on the sort of culture that they have within the Australian Aboriginal communities, go back and watch that old video, because I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty details over here, but let's just say it involves a lot of fetal alcohol syndrome and drinking and sniffing of petrol. That's about what we need to go into here. So these are the sorts of people who will be examining your farmland and giving advice to the government. Or, much more likely, it will be people who 150 years ago maybe had one Aboriginal family member who their great-great-great-grandfather married an Aboriginal woman and had a kid, and then since then, all of your other ancestors are mainly European-descended stock who claim themselves as being Aboriginal because of that, and they get put in the position, because I have seen that happen with Australians.
Is this the Australian version of taking a 23andMe and then being like, oh, I'm 1.3% black, I can say the word?
This is the Elizabeth Warren, I'm totally indigenous, guys. Don't worry about it. I'm completely native, 100%. Whereas they look and act nothing like other Aboriginal peoples. So they want that advisory board, and they say, hold up. If we have a law in place in West Australia which demonstrates practically to people that this will operate as nothing more than just a band of thieves robbing people on their own property, might be difficult to sell the idea that we should give them advice, an advisory board for Parliament. So let's just scrap it. Let's just quietly put this aside and go, no, obviously it would have been a terrible idea with West Australian farming, but with the entirety of the operation of the government, it'll be A-okay. Don't worry about it, guys. It'll go brilliantly. You see where it's a bit telling, the admission?
It's a weird argument. I'm trying to think of where that would ever work otherwise, but...
Yeah, so it's basically just say, if we show these people that these are...
Get rid of Scottish self-rule and then make them independent.
Yes, there you go. Well, basically it's just, well, if we demonstrate practically that they're a bunch of thieves, then people won't want
The
them in
people
charge.
turning up and claiming, I
people-
own this land now because water spirit.
Yes, people won't. I mean, some of the examples that we went over when I was discussing the referendum in the first place, and this follow-up segment to that was that I think somebody got fined $50,000 and given jail time because of the fact that he built a small bridge over his river on his own property, on his farm, because it made it easier for him to navigate his farm, which was his private property. And under the 1972 laws that they had previous to these ones that were implemented last month, they turned up and said there was a water serpent spirit here that you've disturbed, and now the river's going to dry up. And that went through as a legal case, and he got fined in prison time for it. Absolutely ridiculous. So the laws that were already in place are already ridiculous if they can be manipulated to that extent. But these would have just made it even worse. And I'll just carry on with this article. So, Indigenous cultural heritage laws that came into effect in Western Australia just over a month ago are reportedly about to be scrapped following a backlash from farmers. The Western Australia Labor government foreshadowed the about-face at a briefing with big resources companies and Indigenous groups on Friday. Kimberley Land Council Chief Executive Tyrone Garston echoed Mr. Parkin's comments by saying, Aboriginal people in Western Australia never supported these laws. They never supported them in the first place. Yeah, okay. All right, if you say so. All right. Basically, the rollout of the bill has been appalling and the implementation has been even worse. This has been brave, but the right decision by the Premier. So there's just no practical way of implementing it that didn't just turn into gangs of councils showing up at your doorstep and saying, thousands and thousands of dollars, please. This is actually our property if you think about it going back hundreds of thousands of years. It also comes as Prime Minister Anthony Albanese delivered his strongest and most impassioned defense of the voice at Garma Festival on Saturday. But how did the Aboriginals feel outside of this guy speaking on their behalf and saying they never wanted these laws in the first place? Well, the Putu Kunti Kurama and Pinakura Aboriginal Corporation said it was devastated, angered, and betrayed in the wake of the reports. We were going to make so much money from this, is what I'm saying. Imagine the gibs we could have got. So, as I mentioned, these corporations are often fronted by one guy who had one Aboriginal ancestor hundreds of years ago and now claims himself as a full-blooded Aboriginal because, honestly, he's probably the only person fit to be able to serve as a figurehead for these organizations. While the laws were not perfect, they were better than what they replaced, Corporation Chairman Terry Drage said. He called on the federal government to proceed with an Australia-wide regime for cultural heritage protection. So not just Western Australia. He said he wanted it across the entire country. No, terrible idea. He said the preservation of heritage sites was non-negotiable for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. That's where you're wrong, bucko. That's where you're wrong. That's a nice rock you got there. Shame if someone built civilization on top of it.
I don't really understand why any of these people are being even entertained.
No. Well, I do agree to a certain extent. You need to treat the people who were there first with respect. And you can't just, demolish everything that was important to their society before you got there just because you want to. You do need to treat them with a bit of respect. But I'm sorry.
The water spirit?
The water spirit is a step too far. And this was all kickstarted off in the first place because a corporation called Rio Tinto, under the old laws from 1972, where you had a Section 18 provision where you had to go to your government, your local government, and say, can we have permission to operate on this particular site? And the government says yes, or the government says no. They had government approval for what was the Jooken gorge, which supposedly had cave paintings in it that could be traced back 50,000 years or 100,000, 150,000 years, etc., etc. And they blew it up. And despite the fact that they'd already got permission to do so, that's what set all of this off, because you had Aboriginal community leaders showing up and saying, oh, this was part of our ancient cultural heritage. How could you do this? And that's what set that's what snowballed into these laws being put in place in the first place. But from articles we looked at last time, there were already people who were farmers in the area casting doubt on some of the claims that were being made, because he was saying, one of the farmers who'd been interviewed said, well, when we first heard about this, it was 30,000 years. Then afterwards, it was 50,000 years. And then it was 100,000 years and 150,000 years. So honestly, it sounds like they're just making it up, or at least changing the date to make it sound even bigger and more important than it actually was.
I think they might be taking the piss.
It might be. It might just.
Like, could you imagine being the guy who's just like, yeah, you disturbed the water spirit? I mean, when you saying that, I was thinking in my head, what would I do? Because you're not paying the fine. Go to hell. I don't believe in your water serpent spirit. So do you take the money and just like move to a country that doesn't have an extradition treaty with Australia?
I don't know.
You just.
I'm imagining that episode. Do you remember that episode of The Simpsons where they go to Australia and Bart needs to be given the boot?
Yeah.
I'm imagining that kind of
You
situation.
don't pay your fine.
Don't pay your fine, you'll get the boot. So, Western Australia opposition leader Shane Love said that while he hoped that the reports were true that it was going to get repealed, the move is the biggest backflip by a government in many years. And honestly, he's right there. What we've seen is a government that has rammed a piece of legislation through and failed to implement it. Its own members are calling it botched. Mr. Love said that he was looking forward to returning to the drawing board and working on new laws, which would actually protect heritage, but also protect businesses and the property rights of landowners. So hopefully, no, he's being serious with that. If he's a conservative or liberal or whichever ones are the opposition in Western Australia, I can't help but feel that the opposition would do what they do in England, which is turn around and say, don't worry, we'll screw you more gently. But if it's better than what they've got, but even then these people they've already got are repealing the laws in the first place. So it has been confirmed now. They have dumped these laws entirely. The Premier, Roger Cook, announced the backflip after days of talks with stakeholders that agreed the legislation was too complex. The laws went too far, were too prescriptive, too complicated, and placed unnecessary burdens on everyday Western Australia property owners. We will restore the original Act from 1972 with some simple and effective amendments. He said the amendments to old laws would prevent another Jooken Gorge incident. Why that was an incident in the first place when it already had government approval, I don't know. It seems that they had the government approval and then people just turned around and started whining about it afterwards. Importantly, all property owners can continue to operate and manage their property, just like they have over the past few years without any fear of unknowingly disrupting cultural heritage sites, even the ones that get made up on the spot. Under the proposed changes, the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Council will make recommendations to the Aboriginal Affairs Minister. Mr. Cook said the system would be fairer and simpler and reintroduce Section 18 ministerial approvals, with landowners and native title holders given the same right of review. Western Australia Farmers President John Hassel said that the decision was a good outcome because the laws were not workable and farmers had been fearful to make changes on their land under it. He said that the aim of the 2021 legislation had been to protect Australian cultural heritage, but it turned citizen against citizen, as often these laws always do. That is a terrible, terrible outcome of this legislation, he said. He said that the 1972 legislation was also problematic, though, and there is still a long way to go. Because once again, the 1972 legislation is still the stuff that people could get fined $60,000 for building a small bridge on their own property. So, yeah, there's still definitely problems with that whole thing. But Australia seemingly has staved off destruction for a few more months because they've made the correct decision to completely...
You're not ruled by the water spirit. Go away.
For now, they're not, because they still have the referendum going. But how is the referendum campaigns going? Are we getting a Brexit situation where it's pointing in one direction, where it's pointing that Remain will win overwhelmingly? Will yes win overwhelmingly? Well, according to recent polls, no. No, it will not, because everybody's going, this is stupid. If we're not going to give these people permission to do the cultural heritage thing in Western Australia, why would we give them carte blanche to control the entire government through the parliamentary system? That's a stupid idea. No. So 47% of the whole country did not approve of the voice, with 43% in favour and the remaining 10% unsure. Support for the voice, and I find this interesting because these demographics that I'm about to go through seem to mirror themselves and reflect all throughout most of the Western world whenever you get a big progressive issue that's put forward for
the usual suspects
for a vote. So support was strongest amongst women, with 47% in favour compared with 40% opposed, and among young people aged 18 to 34 with 62% in favour compared with 26% opposed. Our generation are idiots. They just are.
It must be the education system.
It has to be the education.
I mean, you don't get that fast of a shift between a world that used to have the young and the old not that divided to this divided, not on issues like economics. Like, I can understand the housing ownership disparity rates within the West, but I can't understand like the random nonsense belief rates Like that, there's no way that's not.
Do you want the petrol sniffers in charge of government? Young people say yes.
Why? Because we told them not about the petrol.
Yeah, because I mean, these people are probably living in cities, living in cultural centres that are away from where all of the Aboriginal peoples are. Like I was talking about.
When you're growing up like that, you have such delusions about how the world actually functions.
I think that was I mentioned last time, the Alice Springs place where there's a kind of a stronghold of, I think it's 20% Aboriginal people who commit about 90% of the crime there. They're also well known for just getting drunk and sleeping in the middle of the road. So it's very common for them to just get accidentally ran over because you're driving down a dirt road at the middle of the night and there's just an Aboriginal sleeping.
Well, I love how you always think like that can't happen, and then you learn about like the Pareto distribution and whatnot, and you realize, oh no, the world is really lopsided.
Yes.
It only takes like 2% of people to do something before it's a huge problem.
Yep. And let's go from here as well. Opposition to the voice was strongest among men. Obviously, 55% of whom said no. Among people aged over 55, 65% of them said no as well. Among supporters of the coalition, minor parties, and independents. So, like I say, these dividing lines everywhere across the West at the moment, and I can only hope that we don't see any fortification of this particular referendum when it comes around later this year. So, congratulations, Australia, for staving off destruction for a few more months. I hope you guys can keep it that way.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content that's on the site, such as the premium articles, this one, Star Citizen, and The Quest for the Future, with an audio track for Silver and Gold tiers. If you'd like to find out what else is being put out, you can follow on Getter at lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you, and goodbye.